All right, everyone. I think we are back live. Hopefully, this time with a functioning podcast with no doubling up of audio. I can't hear myself twice or three times, so I think we're good to go, and I think we've got the all clear. But effectively, this is our Game Week 22 preview. So thank you guys so much for joining us here today. We will be discussing specifically the sort of chip strategies that we have in mind, and of course, just being flexible to the idea that ultimately, especially particularly taking an analytics point of view, you can be quite varied with your approach. I think last season, even though we identified, game week sort of 26 to 28 as good wildcard strategy points, ultimately we saw a lot of different outcomes coming from people wildcarding around those points. And I think we will be back to sort of discuss that. Specifically, we have a Ben Crellin screenshot here, of course, and we will be touching on that in a second. A lot of the sort of decision making will be based around, of course, where you free hit, because I think a free hit probably has even more dramatic consequences of, let's say, how you plan to play your transfers, more so than compared to, let's say, a triple captaincy or a bench boost. On top of that, look, we already sort of recapped our season, so there's no need to really even recap last game week. So we're just sort of jumping right into the information that we have now, which is actually, of course, that Egypt have been knocked out of AFCON, and Salah, unfortunately, is still injured. Haaland is back at full training. KDB, of course, seems to be picking up some fitness, but probably not enough, and will continue to be managed. And beyond that, we have sort of other impacts like Trent coming back as well. And also, in general, of course, what we think is a very, very comfortably secure double game week 25 for Liverpool, but, with no official sort of news on that before the deadline, game week 22. And that's where we are right now. Do you want to go through the sort of Ben Crellin screenshot that you've shared with us, Schadenfreudist?
Yeah, hi everyone. So hopefully the issue has been sorted now. I can see that the chat is saying it's all good now. So glad to know because
Thank God.
we were really at our wits' ends and we didn't know what we would have done if otherwise. So good to know that. So in terms of the chip strategy, we decided to keep this podcast a little short because we've already talked about the bulk of game week 21 and so on our previous episode. So this is really looking forward and taking in whatever new information we got, although we didn't get as much as we wanted to. For example, Chelsea and Villa is still up in the air. As you can see in the screenshot, that game won't be played before game week 24 deadline. So yet another 90 minutes for Ollie Watkins and co, which is not great, and also for Colville, Palmer, and Sterling. So not great overall in terms of their X-Men's prospects. I mean, they will still continue to get minutes. All I'm saying is you unnecessarily introduce more uncertainty for non Premier League games. In any case, we what we're trying to do is we have uh, identified three strategies that kind of make sense for now. Of course, there are a lot of uncertainties, such as for example, we don't even know where the Bournemouth Luton game is going to be scheduled right now. So fixtures like those are not even taken into consideration. For example, if you go on FPL review right now, that game is kind of split up across, let's say, 8 game weeks and
I think it
has
has
been
changed a
given, let's
little
say.
bit. I think it's on 27 and 28. That's the last that I've seen
Yeah, okay,
right now.
okay. So it has changed a little bit, but all I'm saying is from a planning perspective, that doesn't help us a lot because
Mm.
uh, we really need to be looking at, let's say, putting that fixture in 28 and then running all your solves and
Yeah.
then doing the same for any other week that you want to do that. So that's going to take a lot of time. It is computationally intensive as well. So the first strategy that we are kind of looking at, and the first consideration here is that we are not looking to play any chips other than maybe triple captaincy before game week 29. So I think broadly most of us agree with that other than triple captaincy in game week 25, which does seem to be an option. Although Salah, from what I can see, might not be fit for both fixtures, and with Holland, we just need to see what happens. I mean, looking at the training pictures that have come out today, seems like he will start Brentford, but we have to wait and see what happens in the Burnley game. And also, I think after the Brentford game, the Champions League starts up again. So, what do City do? Do they give a priority to his minutes in the Champions League and then rest him in the league? Stuff like that also has to be taken into consideration. Similar to KDB that you talked about. So, all of that you should also be looking at in terms of X-Mins. So the first strategy that we are looking at, and I'm going to come to Fran for what he thinks about, is free hit 29, wildcard 30 or wildcard 33, or between basically 30 and 33. and bench boost 34. So broadly, what do you think about this?
I think it's the most template strategy. We like using that word. It's not meant to be offensive, but sometimes people do take it as such. I think it just sort of strikes out the most because it's like the strategy that feels like it has the most guarantees right now based on sort of our understanding of current events. Although, there is of course could be a double game week in 37. The question is how big is that double game week, and why sort of plan for something so far away when maybe you can get something a lot more tangible with an earlier wild card, which would sort of enhance bench boost 33, 34. And not to mention, of course, when you play the wild card, effectively you do like to play it closer towards your bench boost. So I think intuitively it makes sense to have a strategy that lines you up like so, because otherwise, if you're, let's say, planning to bench boost on 37, it almost feels like you're going to be pigeonholing yourself to not having enough sort of short-term sort of value to have a strong enough bench boost with an early wild card, or you wild card super late and maybe you actually lose out on a lot of sort of short to medium term games that people who wild card early would do. As you said, 30 to 33 are those, that sort of strategic point where you have that sort of international break on 30, and you have a little bit of time to plan around that sort of bench boost on 34. But what I like about this general strategy and that sort of the sort of print is that ultimately we've seen, as I said, even last season, where when we thought that game week 26 wildcard was the best, I think some people, like yourself, even went game week 27 or game week 28. And some of them, of course, reaped the extra benefits of that Liverpool game versus Man United. But the reality is that ultimately, wildcarding, I think, one game week behind or after other people usually doesn't have as bad as a knock on impact as some people think. I think people like to think too rigidly about, hey, I have to wildcard in this window. There's a huge swing on this game week, which I genuinely cannot see, on the calendar what the swing is on wildcard 30. So, beyond there being an international break, I just think this strategy is pretty flexible. But free at 29, of course, it just comes back down to exactly what we're looking with the screenshot here, the probability of an insane amount of blanks. And that's probably the most crucial chip, right? If we think about the short term. So, and why I like this sort of strategic line. So, what are your thoughts about it?
No, I think the biggest point that you said right now is about the flexibility, because normally what happens is, uh, according to your bench boost and maybe your triple captaincy, your wild card is pretty much set for one game week. But as you've rightly pointed out, we can, once we free hit in 29, we don't have an obligation to play the wild card. So
Yeah,
you can keep postponing it. For example, if you keep thinking, okay, my team is good for this week, I don't need to play it for next week. So all we are trying to do here is trying to minimize the gap between when you have to play your bench boost and when you play your wildcard. Now, ideally speaking, it would be zero. So technically, you would want to wildcard in 33 and bench boost in 34, or the other way around. You dead end your wildcard bench boost in 34 and wildcard in 35, something like that. So all I'm saying is, this time, this kind of window of opportunity that we have, we need to take advantage of that, because as you pointed out last season, the only reason people delayed playing that wild card obviously was not to cash in on Liverpool versus United. It was to get more information,
yeah,
and we did get more information. As in, Jason Steele was number one over Robert Sanchez. That was the only piece of information that we got
yeah.
over people that wildcarded the game week before. So I am completely in agreement with you. I think most people will try to stick to this strategy. The only variation I can see is if people have not planned properly for, let's say, free hit, game weeks 25 and 26, because I think overloading your teams with Liverpool, Spurs, and Chelsea for 25 is going to leave you really short for 26. So from that perspective, I think there might be some people who can get caught out. And if you are caught out, then maybe it makes sense to just play it in 26 and then dead end your team sort of into 29 and then wildcard in 30. So in that case, the strategy would become, excuse me, free hit 26, wildcard 30, and then you can bench boost and triple captain whenever you want later down the line. So I think the free hit is going to sort of determine when you will be able to wildcard. For me, and I think for you as well, 29 seems to be the most appropriate game week right now, based on, as you can see in the screenshot. I think an average of 5.3 blanks is pretty unexpected. I did not expect that to be the case let's say a month prior to Game Week 22. So that has changed a lot of things, because even if, let's say, Arsenal Chelsea is still on, have you looked at how many players you will have in from your current team? Let's say you don't do any transfers, you don't make any transfers. Do you know how many players you will have?
Not off the top of my head, not for Game Week
Yeah,
29,
it's,
no. Yeah.
I was trying to think on the fly, and it's there's too much to think about. So, I'm not going to count Pinnock because the only Brentford player I have right now is Pinnock, and I've already talked extensively about how that doesn't matter. Even though Brentford are perhaps the only team who double in 25, have a game in 26, and have a definite game in 29.
Mm.
So, if you want to look at any players, I think those will be Brentford players. Yeah.
Yeah.
So other than that, I'm trying to think of if we wanted to mention anything about the fixtures, but if not, I'm just going to move to the next strategy that we wanted to talk about, and that is wildcard 30, like we mentioned, free hit 34, and bench boost 37. Now, I'm personally not a big fan of this because of leaving the bench boost till 37. And I'll get to Fran because I'm interested to know his thoughts as well. But bench boost 37 essentially for me is a no because I would recommend people to go and listen to Planet FPL's podcast about chip strategy. And they mentioned there that uh, the worst case scenario for Gaming 37 could be that you only have four teams that will double, and that seems like a pretty bleak worst case scenario, and it's not that improbable as well. I think it is still quite low on the probability scale, but it is not entirely impossible. But so if that's the case and we do end up with a scenario like that, then that bench boost is almost of no value to us because you always have teams with uncertain x-means in that period. So for example, let's say this season seems to be like a tight title race. So let's say City, Liverpool, Arsenal, all three are still in it. Uh, Seems to be a reasonable expectation. And if that's the case, we can expect them to go as strong as they could. But also, it could be the case that City are going deep into Champions League and are going deep into FA Cup like they normally do. So if that's the case, who knows what kind of rotation will take place in the City squad. So from that point of view as well, I'm not a big fan of bench boosting in 37 with uncertain X minutes. But yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the scariest thing is always like free hitting when people are bench boosting because it almost feels like
Ooh,
they're
yes,
going to have a squad,
yes,
the bench
yes,
boosters that is, they're going to have a squad that's basically around as good as your free hit squad, but they've got
yeah,
almost additional punts to go with it. Whereas yeah, when you have the option of, let's say, free hitting on a blank that has, this many blanks on paper, on 29 for example, I can't see why I would want to three hit on 34. Although I think it's always tempting because people just think, I can go with 11 doublers, but I just tend to think, how many doublers are going to be down versus the bench boost crowd, and then how good is bench boost 37? Like, you're putting a lot of hedging sort of into that situation, and also sort of probably you're dead ending on gaming 29, I guess, which is also probably not the sort of best time to be dead ending with, because you're going to have a pretty awful team. It's not like you can even do any sort of lucrative sort of punts on that sort of game week. I think a lot of people will end up making the same transfer as you would on game week 29, so it doesn't feel like there's any sort of unique value to dead ending there. Whereas, for example,
yeah.
the
Sorry,
crowd who's
and
free hit, yeah.
also sorry for a dead ending in 29. One more thing I wanted to ask you was between 26 and 29, there don't seem to be a lot of weeks as well. So
Mm.
your free transfers are also far few for you to actually get a full squad of players for 29 in any case, right?
Yeah, no, that's true as well.
Yeah.
I think the scariest thing is when I think about all people's squads, like when you look at the probabilities for the blanks, it's like teams like Sheffield United or teams like Everton, where a lot of people, own their sort of bench fodder with, yeah, they're most likely not going to play. So just even if you're trying to create a bit of a hamstrung squad for Gaming 29, I just think it's very, very hard. It's only really, I guess, Chelsea that would be your saving grace. But the problem, of course, is that that fixture is so bad. So,
Mm.
your Gustos, who are your cheap players, or even when I'm thinking about myself, like Colwell, what sort of value am I getting really from these players? I'm not quite sure. So
Yeah.
that's why I feel like it is such a bad week, and such a week that feels nice to free hit 29 in. And we always tend to think that a free hit is probably actually not as good of a chip, um, as people think in terms of like the true ceiling of it. But whenever you have guarantees like, extra additional appearance points, it always seems to pay out. And yeah, taking an analytics approach recently, I feel like I've sort of swung fully towards that direction, for sure.
Yeah, and one more thing to point out here is I think the gap between wildcard and bench boost is quite large as well.
Yeah,
So I would
extremely large. Yeah.
think that even if you do want to go through, let's say, free hit 34 strategy, I think wildcard 36, bench boost 37 probably makes more sense from that point of view. Although that does make navigating the initial stages of the season quite difficult, I would imagine, because you essentially have 5 to 6 free transfers to navigate between 25, 26, and 29, which seems awfully sticky, if
I
I'm being
I
completely
think the
honest.
graphic
So,
that FPL Spaceman put out today shows you how
yeah.
hard it is to navigate that run of games without a wild card. You know,
Yeah, essentially, you needed more teams as the intersection of all three circles, right? But you have
exactly, yeah.
literally zero teams in that intersection, which is quite an awful thing, actually, from
Exactly.
a planning
That makes it
perspective.
awful. And the only saving grace we have this season is that I think players are priced well enough where we're almost all having 14 to 15 players within our teams. I
Yes.
know I am, at least.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of
so
course, of course. So the final strategy, and I think we don't need to spend much time because we've covered it probably in this one, which was free hit 29, wildcard 35, and bench boost 37, which is what I already mentioned.
yeah,
So I think that seems to be reasonably okay because
yeah.
essentially what you're doing is you're dead ending in 34. So you can make transfers from 29, essentially from 30 till 34, just to get as many double game week players as you can, and then you wildcard in 35 makes perfect sense, I think, from that perspective. So I think I'm still sticking to probably A because that does give us a lot of flexibility, which we talked about. And then if not, I think the one that I just spoke about, which is free 29, wildcard 35, bench boost 37, is probably my backup plan in case the because one thing that I did here in the Planet FL podcast is that the 34 doubles may not be as enticing for the big teams. So the players that we have from all those top four, top six classic big six teams might not be great in terms of expected value. So, and you and I were talking off air as well that the only incentive for us to free hit probably could be the fact that we need players from mid-table teams
Mm,
that we don't want to have in our teams long term,
yeah.
and then that would probably make a case for free hit 34. Although, as you've already outlined, I see several flaws in that path. So I think I would probably stick to free hit 29 for now. And one more thing to mention, which is again, Ben has already tweeted about that, which is that if Chelsea, Bournemouth, and Luton don't make it to the FA Cup semi-final, then we could only end up with three double game weeks. So only 25, 34, and 37. And that is quite crucial because right now I think bookies odds-on favorite are Villa by a very slight margin, I think,
Yeah.
and City obviously are huge favorites against Luton, and Bournemouth play Leicester, and Leicester are doing pretty well in the championship, so you can't rule out Leicester beating Bournemouth as well. So if that happens, then we could very well end up in a situation where you don't have an option but to play the chips in these weeks because there are going to be no other small double game weeks, let's say Bournemouth Luton or something of that nature. So we might be forced into these 3 game weeks, and that is a bad. I think I don't know what do you feel about that, but normally people say it's bad for FPL because that really narrows or it really stops people from diverging in terms of chip strategy, right?
Yeah, but I feel like it's actually worse for us in the sense that when I think about people like willing to sell Solanke, like maybe if they
Sure.
if they did so, like let's say ahead of a double that was sort of like sporadically sort of put on the schedule, it would feel better if I was someone who was, with the sort of transfers being available to sort of move into certain players. I just think, yeah, that one fixture is probably not going to make or break the season, Bournemouth versus Luton. So outside of that, I mean, I don't really care too much because I feel like chip sheet season is always a little bit rigid, and people always think that there's like a lot of different strategies that you can play. You definitely can, but it almost feels like, yeah, you just have to hope that the week you're wild carding or the week you're free hitting, you have, let's say, those 2 to 3 players, and you're kind of being held up by outcome. But everyone's paths are pretty similar in terms of the strategic outline. I don't think it changes too much. Even last season, we had some crazy results, but beyond the wildcard weeks in specific, we all sort of free hit mostly on the same week, unless you, let's say, wanted some James Ward-Prowse variants versus Tottenham, and you free hit earlier and things like that. But those are for the true psychopaths, and even then, the people sort of attempting those strategies are the ones who are even more invested in the game. So I feel like,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
I don't really mind either way, frankly.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. So, we will talk more about chip strategy as we progress through the season. And I think as we get closer to Game Week 25, both Fran and I think we'll have a handle on exactly what strategy we might want to commit to, because I'm going to come to Fran's transfers now and we'll talk about them because that is what we have penciled in next. But I think that your transfers right now will slowly start to dictate what your transfer strategy could be.
Yeah.
And so that's a good segue into transfers, which is before we go into the general transfers that we're seeing in the meta, you've made your transfers already, right? So what are they?
Yeah, I've done and actually you can tell that I've already sort of pigeonholed myself into free at 29 because I've done Salah to Eze, which actually sort of continues to keep another sort of blank game weaker, well, prospectively at least. And then I've also done Cash to Walker. And now Cash obviously is arguably a player who blanks most weeks himself, but the reality, of course, is that Aston Villa and Chelsea. So I had Cash and Colwell. These are both players who could maybe blank on Game Week 29. Doesn't seem like the probability is very high, but regardless, I think because Colwell has such a bad fixture there, and I'd rather free hit anyways. I'm pursuing sort of a cash move out, and I think cash is also close to a price fall. So I went for Walker, and then my second move, as I said, was Salah versus, with Eze, is simply one where I can get a lot of short-term expected value, which is something that's nice, I think, when I don't have to take a hit to do so. And then I can simply leave room for Julian Alvarez to Haaland in one transfer. So the way that I can do that is just with the amount of money I have in the bank, which is 8.7 million in the bank. So yeah, I can go to Haaland with one move, and even after, let's say, going for Haaland, I'd still have 1.7 million for future game weeks. And I think for once, I'm actually looking at my squad and I'm super happy, super content with it. We'll see, of course, whether Elise takes Eze's penalties away, but um, I wanted to go to Eze because I think his minutes in the Sheffield United game are more guaranteed than Elise. And if you look at Eze, actually, he's sort of someone who you really are going to play just 1 or 2 weeks over this run, and then he can cover
Yeah.
you in some sort of blanks. And I'm totally fine with that because ultimately I'm going to be spending a lot more money, budget wise within my forwards, and I've got Trent as well, who's going to be most likely a double gaming 25 player. So sort of locked myself into that sort of team structure. But I have room, obviously, for a Liverpool defender on Game Week 25, which will still keep me a little bit more flexible for Game Week 26.
So interestingly, I am also thinking about bringing in the Liverpool defender again because I sold Trent last week.
Mm.
So if you were to, let's say, partner Trent with yet another Liverpool defender, would you prefer Robertson over Van Dijk, or would you go for Van Dijk because we're still unsure about how Robertson is going to be reintegrated?
Yeah, frankly, I would go Virgil. I mean, we've been seeing in
Yeah,
the past that Robertson is capable of being rested and rotated in double game
yeah,
weeks, right?
yeah,
Virgil
yeah.
just doesn't have that probability. I remember last season, actually, I was seeing other people who went Robertson, but I had clearly gone for Darwin anyways. But I remember the people who, went for Darwin won out in terms of EV, and the people who went for Virgil won out in terms of points. And the people
Points.
who lost out on both were Robertson owners who actually, unfortunately, he was rested for one of those
We didn't
fixtures.
start. Yeah, exactly. Yes, yes,
Exactly.
I remember
So
now.
I just feel like
Yeah.
it's very probable. I mean, look the way Jurgen sort of really respects people coming back, and also people just putting in a crazy shift. And Robertson, especially since there's actually a decent amount of depth now within the team, and Joe Gomez is playing well on the left. I think it's just something that I'm going to be excluding Robertson within my transfer plans, and I've done so even a few weeks past before Robertson was actually back and
Yeah,
sort of fit and ready to
yeah.
play. Him not even featuring, for example, or actually starting the previous matches, an even bigger sign as to where, let's say, how far behind he is in terms of the pecking order. I think compared to like Trent, who was out for effectively a few weeks, but is already sort of getting really good minutes. And Robertson, of course, I still think, yeah, is not a realistic pick. And when you look at review, obviously it just expects Robertson to play, right? So we always talk about the trap of owning a defender when he doesn't start, and I think it's so
Mm.
likely that he doesn't. So definitely Virgil van Dijk. Are you looking for Virgil?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking if so the moves that review is recommending right now is go from Salah to Richarlison,
Hmm.
roll next week, and in 24 transfer in both fullbacks of Liverpool. So instead of that, I might just do Trent and Van Dijk. Sorry, Virgil in,
Right.
and
Okay.
instead of Robertson,
Yeah.
because the problem with that, of course, I can understand already is this that means no Holland. So all of that is still in the air right now. There's nothing set in stone. Also, I was looking at price rises because I was going to ask you, did you do that because you were afraid of Salah price drop?
No, I'm just extremely busy at work, and
Oh,
I,
okay.
I
Oh,
won't
fair.
be I won't be on my phone tomorrow. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
fair enough.
that's the
Okay, okay, okay.
unfortunate sadness of life, I
Yeah,
suppose.
I was looking at fplstatistics.co.uk, which is I don't know this. I still use it, and Trent is set to drop, but it's weirdly showing as like a lot of people are bringing
I,
him
I
in,
feel I
so he
feel like
might
he's
not
he's
drop.
been set to drop for a while, and
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
avoided
he
it.
might not
So
drop. I don't think he's going to drop. I
prayers up
think.
for him dropping. The only
Yeah,
conundrum that I actually have within my team is whether I start Trent versus Gabriel, and I know a lot of people just immediately have been telling me Trent.
yeah. I
Um,
was going to come to that. Yes.
But I just wonder if there's a world where he gets subbed off early. We talked about this before the pod actually started. You made a good point where it's like, the best case scenario obviously is Trent just gets subbed off post 60 and gets a clean sheet, and it's also quite likely as well, given that the game is at Anfield. But in terms of, let's say, Gabriel, I feel like he's definitely going to be 0-90. So that's sort of the way I'm looking at it. Whereas with Trent, I'm a bit iffy as to whether he plays 60 or 90, and there's a lot of still guaranteed EV with Gabriel playing 90 versus Nottingham Forest away. So maybe from a grassy point of view, I like home fixtures, so that's why Gabriel's on my bench. But I'll be one of the few managers I think who's very very comfortably benching Palmer, who I captained last week. So that's always a nice little thing in FPL to be able to do, like a nice little
Yeah,
flex.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think you and I, if Gabriel does not play, you and I would end up having no Arsenal defenders this week.
Yeah, which would be a huge difference versus the field that we are playing against, or the field
Exactly. That
within the
is,
field. To be honest, the analytics FC
yeah,
is
exactly.
definitely going to be fielding at least one Arsenal defender. I feel.
That is kind of a terrifying prospect, I must admit. And also, before we move on to captaincy, which I think is a big dilemma, or not a dilemma, but like a pentalemma, whatever you want to call it. There's so many options this week. One thing which is still left is the city assets that we want to bring in terms of the double game week as well. So, do you still think that Foden in is a good idea? Because, for example, I already bought Foden last week. You did the same as well.
Yeah.
But as we get closer to the double game week, and as more and more City players are fit and in contention to play minutes, do you think it's a good idea for people to still keep bringing in Foden?
I think yes, because he's guaranteed a double, and there are not many other players in the game who you would say have more guaranteed minutes than him, taking into account that double. So, when I look at KDB, for example, as you said, he could be rested and rotated, potentially even more so than Foden. When I look at
Yeah.
Bernardo within the same squad, yes, of course, Bernardo is the player that we sort of historically look at as the one who gets the most minutes, but I do think that he also gets to sort of be rested a little bit more
Hmm.
in the premier stages of the season. So, for example, what used to happen to Mahrez, I feel like could very well happen to Bernardo as well. And Foden, of course, I think is still playing brilliantly, and I wouldn't be too worried about him. Although I'm not looking at him as some sort of 90-minute player, right? I think we all own Foden, knowing that he could start on the bench one of those games, but I can't see him suddenly becoming a bench fodder type of player in this stage of the season, and considering the fitness of some of the key players who would be taking his minutes. Something that I think Luke mentioned himself was that the impact of Stones coming back will have some impacts on, let's say, KDB, Foden, and Silva, and how Liverpool, or sort of how City will actually sort of play, depending on, let's say,
Hmm.
Walker holding wide right. That's going to have an impact on Foden for sure. But ultimately, as I said, because you have the existence of the double, and when you compare it to, let's say, someone like Jota, who I know a lot of people are looking at, he has an insane probability of a blank. And when you look at the rest of the field, they just don't have that additional fixture. So it's very hard to say that I think Foden's a bad transfer. I still think he's actually a very reasonable one, to be honest. And if you can get good minutes versus Burnley, which still seems highly probable here, he's going to be a great transfer anyways. So that's where I'm sort of at with Foden.
Yeah, and I think unlike previous seasons, I think this is the season where we've actually seen him being played in every single position that people have touted him to play. For example, in center midfield, on the right wing, on the left wing, maybe as a false nine. So, from that perspective as well, I think unlike other seasons where he has been restricted to a certain role, I think there's a lot more to his game and to him being a part of the team this season. So I completely agree with you. I think because we play Champions League fantasy as well, and uh, when I think about his minutes from that perspective as well, I haven't ever thought of him as being okay. He's going to be suddenly benched,
Mm.
which is unusual because we are always used to Foden being this sort of a player that people know is going to be a star, but he's always left on the bench and he's all of a sudden played a couple of games and then he's left back on the bench. So this season seems to be slightly different from that point of view, but as you said, not going to counter him playing 90 minutes going move forward because there are so many players that are back that he could easily play, let's say, 70 to 75 minutes every single week. So I think that's still great, right? Because how many players do you have who are going to play that regularly in that kind of an attacking team with, let's say regular XG generation, because
Yeah.
Jota and everyone, the people are going to be looking to bring in Jota. I'm pretty sure he's going to be brought in even more. I think if he manages to score again this week, I think he might even be on the cusp of, let's say, 100% EO by the time double game week arrives.
I forgot about the
Because
narrative that Jota always scores versus Arsenal as well. I didn't think about that
oh
actually.
yes,
Yeah, that's gonna be an
oh yeah, I completely forgot about that. My God. Okay. Yeah. That's going to be a nightmare, I think. Anyway, moving on to captaincy. I'm just going to rattle off all the names and then we can discuss them. So the five names that I have noted down, and I'm going to be mentioning the sixth name because Fran owns him, and I like him as a player. Those are Richarlison, Foden, Alvarez, Saka, Eze, and Darwin, of course. So because you own, I think all five. You own all five. I own four out of the first five.
mm,
Uh, the top five rather.
yeah.
Who are you going for personally?
Yeah, I'm actually looking at this sort of list here. It's 7 players, and I own all of them.
You own all of them. That's crazy.
So
That's actually
that's
crazy.
that's nice. That's nice for my
Yeah.
MD. I will be grabbing that very shortly. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. But
Yeah.
no, I think I'm pretty set on Richarlison. We talked about this. I think it's still between Foden and Richarlison. We know that Alvarez, look,
Yeah.
if Holland is on the cusp or if he's on the bench, you sort of throw out those Alvarez minutes because you're thinking it's 65 probably, something like that. I think it's very reasonable. With Saka, it's like, you're pushing it for him to be a good captaincy pick because like if you're on the precipice and there's two players who can conceivably quite easily get 90 minutes in Foden and Richarlison, I just think it's so hard to go with players like Saka as a even I think Darwin we said if you adjust his minutes to 90, which is he got rested when sort of Liverpool had a big lead versus Norwich and gave Trent a few minutes to get onto the field and get back to a little bit of fitness. He could sort of also I think usurp for example someone like Eze. So I'm not thinking about any of them. So as I said, going back to it, really, it's between Foden and Richarlison and who I think will get the most minutes. You've told me very sensibly that it's probably Richarlison. I also think it's Richarlison. I mean, we saw, for example, the FA Cup game versus City, where ultimately the depth is still pretty weak with Son out. Brennan Johnson isn't playing particularly well. Neither really is Werner, and they're sort
Yeah.
of probably going to replace each other if Kulusevski plays on the right. And even if Madison plays, that's sort of what I'm sort of thinking will happen, as a 10 almost. Is Richarlison's minutes going to be impacted? I don't think so. But it could happen, and he hasn't gotten as much rest as he usually would, given that Spurs, we always like to talk about how they're not involved in many competitions, but they are involved in the FA Cup, or they were at least. And so this is sort of only 5 days of rest, I think, for Richarlison. So maybe that will have some knock-on impacts, but I think he's also overcome the injuries that he's had and the sort of lack of match fitness that he's had. So we've seen really good minutes from him the last 2 games. I don't see why that would necessarily change. So I'm pretty locked on Richarlison.
Yeah. I think you pretty much covered Foden and Richarlison. So I'm going to briefly just talk about between. I think my choices are between Foden and Saka essentially,
Hmm.
and I completely agree. Alvarez, even though we probably know that Alvarez might just end up playing 80-85,
Yeah.
I think that's a risk far too great to take because in the off chance that he does get subbed off around 60-65, that's bad for your MD. That's bad for points from all perspectives. It's really bad. So I'm looking at between Foden and Saka, and for Saka, we know he's going to play 90 minutes. There is no doubt. So I guess it's between what I think is the worst case scenario for Foden, which is around 75 minutes to 80 minutes, and uh, worst case for Saka is still around 90 minutes, which is what I'm looking at. So for right now, my captaincy is on Foden. The only reason it might go on Richarlison is, sorry, not Richarlison, Saka or Richarlison maybe, is if I do make the transfer from Salah to Richarlison, because review is recommending me to do that. But obviously, because Spurs are going to be blanking in 26, I am really apprehensive about making that move because it's such a short term move that I, I'm really struggling to see the benefits of that. So I might just end up captaining Saka or Foden. So it's between those two for now.
Yeah, that's super sensible.
Yeah.
Um,
So do you want to take chat questions before
yeah,
we
yeah, absolutely.
sign up? Okay.
Um,
So
so
yeah. So
Adam's first
Adam's,
question is, I'm very
yeah.
stuck
Go
between
ahead.
Eze and Elise. Elise is fit now, and I'm guessing he starts for Sheffield United. Eze is on set pieces, maybe on pens, but Elise feels more explosive. I mean, to be honest, like Elise could very well be on both. But I've gone into Eze thinking I think Eze is still on penalties. I think the conventional wisdom is that as Eze is on penalties. I think it's yes, of course, Elise took a penalty whilst Eze was on the pitch, but there is like a very specific sort of game state situation there. Which is, for example, unlike the Areola situation where they suddenly have to change their goalkeeper to save a penalty. This is like the opposite situation where, Palmer, for example, he could have been, for example, subbed in to take the penalty versus Brighton. In this instance, of course, I think Eze came on the field and a penalty was earned, but I don't think he even touched the ball, and at least they just took a penalty, right?
Yeah.
So
So
if yeah.
I think it was against City, right? Or I forgot who it was against, but they basically scored a goal in the, pretty much the 100th minute. And you're right, he came on 5 minutes before, and it was his first game back from injury. So there are a lot of factors that are in play there. So I definitely don't think Eze is definitely off penalties, but the fact that they did not get even a single penalty and Eze didn't take one to just reassure us makes me have some sort of doubt if Eze is on penalties, and I think that doubt is enough for me to not even consider him for captaincy. I think
Mm,
that's all
that's a good shout.
there is
Yeah.
to that. Yeah, I think that helps me to eliminate him as a captaincy option.
But
But
what
other
what
than
do, what
that,
do you actually think about like underlying, like even on underlying stats? Maybe you've looked historically at these two players. Like, what do you think about it? I know Elise is a Manchester United target, so maybe someone close
oh
to your heart. But
yes, I really don't understand how we recruit these days, but yeah. So I for underlines, I wait. I think we have the career rates right on review now. So if I just do this, so I mean Eze's projected XG is 0.37
mhm,
for this week,
yeah,
which does seem to be in line with the opposition and sort of his career rates. So if this is so tough between these two, but just because Olise is coming back from an injury, and I think he has had a history of coming back from injury and then getting re-injured, and then it's sort of a cyclical thing. I think it's the same with Eze, by the way. I don't think Eze is any better in this scenario, but I just think because Olise is just coming back from an injury, I would just go with Eze.
yeah.
That's probably the extent of that.
Yeah, with small sample size, I
Yeah.
think Elise has much better underlying stats this season. But
Yes.
I
Yes.
think the biggest thing that you can say is Elise might not even start. I know
Yeah.
when a manager says someone's fit, I know Roy Hodgson's not exactly a liar or someone that we would compare to some of the best liars we have in the Premier League. But um, hopefully he would have also learned a small bit of a lesson in terms of how he manages players coming back from injury, so that they don't get injured again. But who knows? I'd like to think he might have learned something. I think it wouldn't make sense for Elise to start immediately, even though the fixture is nice. But this is not how football works. You don't look at a good fixture and think this is where you should play 90 minutes. It's
Exactly.
like you need to
Yeah.
build someone's fitness back. For me, it would make sense to go for Eze, as I said, because so much of the sort of value of moving into a player between Eze and Elise is tied to this week.
Yep. Yep.
So why not go for the player who actually gives you those guarantees in terms of the minutes, which would be for me and my answer Eze. But I
So,
think it's
sorry, I just have a question for you because interested to know your thoughts. So next week, I think they play Brighton, right? So you plan on starting Eze for that game, I'm assuming?
yeah.
Okay, great. I just wanted to know about your thoughts for next week. So, okay.
Well, I'm not
So,
forced to. I will say I'm not forced to start him.
oh, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Hmm. So maybe we'll have a look at that next week. Not next week. It's in a couple of days, I guess. So the next is okay. Hunt says, yeah, even with Arsenal, Chelsea, it's rough. Agreed. Yep, he had Robo. So VC says, what is the plan to get back Salah later? Yeah, so I still own Salah. I'm just going to let Fran answer this because I have no idea.
There is no plan basically. That's we're gonna take the L if people triple captain him on 25 and he's fit magically on 24, versus Burnley, which I think is super unlikely by the way.
Nah.
Um, but yeah, I think there's no plan to really get Salah back. Is the unfortunate truth. I'll have to sort of pray that Liverpool get some clean sheets and that he doesn't absolutely tear things up like he did versus Newcastle. And then actually probably survive until game week 31 or something like that. Um, or game week 30, as I said, if I'm
Yeah,
wildcarding around
yeah.
there. Basically, my next wildcard is when I'd be getting Salah back into my team. So that's sort of how I've planned it. And I think that's totally fine because you just have to look at the structure of everyone's teams now and just sort of, say to yourself, you can't own everyone. If I continue to own, for example, Trent and Holland, I'm immediately blocked from owning Salah in the future. So that's something I'm comfortable with. I'm still spending my budget, adequately. I'm still creating squads, I suppose, that would have good MD that compare and fare versus Salah. But the captaincy swings could be very brutal, which I think is probably most people's concerns because we've had some big captaincy hauls from Salah that we haven't enjoyed, unfortunately, between the two of us this season.
Yeah.
But I'm prepared to take that on the chin, so that's the reality.
I mean, also, I would say that there is a slight chance that that is not necessarily true because if Holland is not fully fit and
Hmm.
his minutes are being managed, you can easily just bring back Salah
That's
if you
true.
see
Yeah,
that he's fit. So it's not completely ruled out, but I understand what you mean in terms of the average case scenario that you're looking at. Salah is not part of your medium term planning, I would say. So fair enough. Anthony says, "What's the thoughts on Palmer versus Gordon this game week? Cheers." So I would personally play his.
I'd go
Have you
Palmer.
looked at?
I'd personally go Palmer.
Yeah,
I haven't looked at the review, but
I
I
would.
would go Palmer.
Yeah, let's just have a quick look at what review says. In just to, I'm just going to use 50/50 MD and market odds, so I just have a sense of. Yeah, I think penalties is what swings it for me because Newcastle away have been dire and Liverpool away is a really bad fixture, but on the face of it, at least you have a player on penalties and also great XA, which I mean Gordon also has
He's
pretty
got
good
good
underlines.
XA this
I'm
season.
not going
Yeah,
to lie, absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, so Gordon is predicted on 3.6 and Palmer is on 3.6.
This is your
So okay,
classic
so
50-50
my,
though. So
my
yeah,
yeah, but I'm saying like my trepidation is kind of justified anyway.
yeah.
So I would also go with Palmer. I agree. Yeah. Anyway, that is all there was to this game week. As we said, we already recorded last game week's reactions last week. So please have go and listen to that podcast if you are interested. And hopefully we'll record. I think we have only 2 days, right? Between I think the game week
The
ends on
deadline
February
and the
1st,
next deadline. Yeah,
and the next deadline is February 3rd. So we will be trying to squeeze in a stream. I think either on February 1st or February 2nd, depending on our schedules. But hopefully you'll join us whenever we do stream. Thank you for listening to us. If you like the podcast, subscribe to us, like this video, share it, and also please do the same on any of the podcasting platforms if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, etc. And have a great game week.